This is Eric Rutan of Cannibal Corpse. You are listening to the Scars and Guitars podcast with Andrew McKay Smith.
This conversation is another cracking entry into the Chronicles of Filth. Ladies and gents, you'll hear from Woz Sarginson. If you are unfamiliar, Woz is Cradle of Filth's second ever drummer, and also their fourth, as he returned after Nick Barker left the group. Woz recorded the majority of the cuts on the 1999 released EP From the Cradle To Enslave. Now, as regular listeners have come to expect, there is plenty of deep insight into the machinations of the group. Woz delivers. It's all on the table, and I'm very appreciative that he was willing to share his experience and observations from his time in the band and his ongoing association. In addition to Cradle of Filth, Woz was a part of Extreme Noise Terror, so we discuss his tenure in that group as well. For those listening via the podcast apps, before the chat starts, you will hear the EP's title track From the Cradle to Enslave, and for those on YouTube, let's cut to the conversation right now. Let's go.
Never fake a second coming back from the cradle.
I've always been intensely fascinated with the era of Cradle of Filth that you're a part of. And to set the scene, from my conversations with people over YouTube comments from the other interviews and conversations, I should say, that I've posted, there seems to be two cohorts. There's people like me who grew up in the 90s who were there when Gen 2 black metal kind of first blossomed. So Emperor, Immortal, Satirical, and Cradle of Filth, these sort of bands. And then we sort of dropped off, didn't we? And sort of life, we got into our late 20s, 30s, now 40s. And I'm fortunate that I've sort of come back around in my 40s and I've been able to reignite my interest again, if you like. But there's a whole swathe of us that are sort of from that 90s era. And we have a very different take on Cradle of Filth than somebody who got into them post-Midian, post-2000, if you like. The goth, I call it the Marilyn Manson goth aspect of it, which I have no interest in whatsoever, I must say. It doesn't appeal to my sensibilities,
And as we'll talk, it's I can relate to what you're saying, but it's kind of different for me as well. But I agree with you. It's certainly the people that are into the scene back then. Well, even before then, there's so many different sort of takes on it, and it's like I always say, there's stuff that I don't like about metal now, but that's not them being shit. That's me. It's my interest has changed. It doesn't mean that just because I don't get it doesn't mean that all these people are wrong. It's just we evolve, and it depends when you come across music. If you come across music at a certain time when you're young, it can affect you or I in a different way than people. What am I trying to say? Basically, I think when you discover an album or a band, at that point, that album means something more to you than it does to people who've been listening to it for years. Do you know what I mean? And
so true. Yeah, that's such a great point.
It's weird.
Your involvement in Cradle is largely hidden, but is crucial. Okay, so to set the scene for the audience, people listening, you performed on From the Cradle to Enslaved EP on the title track From the Cradle to Enslave, Death Comes Ripping, and also Sleepless, the Anathema cover. Now, you certainly had the pedigree to join Cradle of Filth after working with Robin and December Moon, and also another killer release. I love this one here, the Extreme Noise Terror album, Damage 381. I've spoken to Barney about that album. Now, I want to cover your time in Extreme Noise Terror too, because you were part of a fascinating episode there for that group. But, the reason that we have come together, of course, is Cradle. Now, just to give you some background, you've probably seen, though, that I've had lengthy conversations with Stuart, with Nick, keyboard player, Greg Moffat, Ben Ryan, the original keyboard player.
I listened to a bit of the Ben one after you got in contact with me. I checked out a little bit of Ben's podcast with you. Yeah,
lovely fella, very easy to talk to, and gave a lot of insight into those early days. A big entry in my catalogue, if you like, is the chat that I had with Paul Allendo, although for Paul's own reasons. We spoke for a couple of hours. He wanted me to remove or not broadcast any conversation around Cradle of Filth. He just wanted to focus on his newer outfit.
He's a funny fucker, bless him.
He's a lovely fella too, I've got to say. But he gave me some amazing insight into the group. I've got to share that I've got to say, I don't think anybody else would know. He just gave it all to me and then said, I don't want you to share that. And I will always respect that when I'm having conversations. Same thing as you, mate.
Everything that I'm going to say, I'm happy for you to broadcast, unless I get to the point that I'm saying it and I'm like, actually, shit, don't broadcast that. But there's no skeletons in the closet from my point of view. I think it's, it is. I'm happy to talk about it. So.
And look, I have had a superficial conversation with Danny for the show, but it was a part of the promotion for Cryptoriana, so we really weren't able to go deep. Okay, we're only able to talk about touring plans, album, and all the usual bullshit.
Absolutely, I understand. Yeah.
Your name has come up a couple of times, and from what I understand, you are considered a valued contributor to the group from the player's perspective, which is very important. Now my first question for you is, as I've mentioned, you had the pedigree to be in the band long term. So were you brought into the band with the intentions of being there long term as a tenured member, or you just bought in for the studio episode?
Right. So first of all, I was in the band. You didn't mention this, but I was in the band before they got signed originally.
Oh, okay.
So just after the TFD demo, Darren Garden, the original drummer, left. I replaced him. I did maybe about 10 gigs with them. The one of them's actually on YouTube, where we supported Bolt Thrower. It was Bolt Thrower and Benediction and us on first, without blowing my trumpet or our trumpet. That was right at the time where Cradle were just about taking off. We blew the shit out of Benediction and Bolt Thrower. Both bands are great, but both bands were kind of on a downward scale. Anyway, and this was just after TFD and just before Principle. Now we went into the studio to record what was going to be an EP, a 12-inch, which would have came out before Principle. That 12-inch never happened, never transpired. And shortly after that, Nick replaced me in the band. I've stayed in contact with everyone throughout my travels since then. And from the Cradle to Enslave, basically it was on the ropes. Nick's tenure with the band was on the ropes. So just prior to that, Rob literally lived over the road, and I was in contact with Rob anyway for the December Moon thing. And he was like, "Look, Nick's gonna leave. There's tensions in the band. Would you be up for doing it?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course I would." So, but I knew that there wasn't. How am I going to say this? I knew that there wasn't much chance of that, because they were literally playing a lot of shows and they had a lot going on. And I actually spoke to Faye at the time, and she was like, "Look, it's getting pretty hectic. Can you learn the set and just be ready?" So that to me was absolutely ridiculous, because I'm not the same drummer as Nick, right? My feet were never that fast. They still aren't. So I was very realistic in what I can do or could do. So I looking back on it, it was ridiculous, because, yeah. But anyway, so that was the deal. So I was on standby, if you like. That call never happened. Obviously, Nick stayed in the band until a point where he left, where they weren't touring or didn't have any shows planned. And then I went to do From the Cradle to Enslave. Now, I went in purely as a session guy. There was I did those songs, which were relatively literal. Well, I think we had a week's rehearsal, and then we went and recorded it in Liverpool, Park Street Studios. And I remember having this conversation again where I'm sitting now in my house. You got to get some context. We had Rob over the road. We had there's a band called Annihilated from Ipswich. He lived across the street. We had Phil from Extreme Noise Terror just down the road. So literally, and Dan actually now lives around the corner from me. So this little square of Ipswich, where I'm in, west side of Ipswich, was proper metal in those days. Anyway, I remember speaking in a pub around the corner, and Dan was like, "Well, do you want to do it?" And I had to explain to him. I said, "Look, it was a good nearly 10 years since my first time with the band." I said, "Look, I can't play like that. You know, Cruelty and the Beast is it's a terrible production, but in terms of songwriting, in terms of what it is, it's such a monolith. It's such an awesome album." So my drumming style was very much, by that time, real kind of straight ahead, sort of simple. I used to refer to like Peter Criss, you know. I get the job done, but you know, I'm not bells and whistles like Nick was. I mean, Nick's playing and his that whole extreme metal playing was something that I'll never forget. Dan was just like, "Well, it's just practice, isn't it?" I'm like, "Yeah, it is just fucking practice, Dan. But we haven't got months for me to practice and get everything down. It's just not possible, you know." And I remember there was a show that they did at the Dynamo, which was the one that was the show that was upcoming, and they got a guy called Dave Hersheimer to do that.
Yeah, correct.
And I've not heard the recordings, but I remember Rob getting back and he was just saying, "Oh, it was just horrible. It was just terrible." But like I say, I can't comment on that because I've never heard it. But I just love the naivety of Dan saying, "Well, it's just practicing. It just, put a few hours of your day aside and learn the songs." And I'm like, "Yeah, it is. But you've got tours, you've got an agenda, everything's in place. It's not as easy as that." So I was offered the gig, but I politely said I can't do it simply because I couldn't play like that. And I was honest with myself. I thought, looking back now, I don't think that you could argue that I could have put the hours in and worked hard. Yeah, sure. But as a drummer and as a fan of that type of music back in the day, I know how meticulous these drum spotters listen to things, and they're like, "Oh," because I remember when I played in the Blood Divine, I used to get these people coming up to me after gigs because I never got any women because I was a drummer. And I'd get these drum spotters coming up and saying, "Oh, yeah, well, you did that differently then than you did on the album. Why?" And I'm like, "I don't know, mate. I've had a few pints. I just went up and enjoyed myself. I'm sorry that I played that fill wrong." So I was very conscious of that. But yeah, so that's how that worked out. Obviously, I'm really pleased that I got to do the EP with them. I don't think that it's... I don't think that my work musically holds a candle to what Nick or what Adrian did, but I think that's part of its charm, I think the part of the simplicity of it, and the fact that it's one of their most popular songs, I'm pleased. So yeah, sorry to ramble on around your question, but that's basically the long and short of it.
No, it's awesome. No, ramble as much as you like. I've got to give you mad props. So I remember when I first heard From the Cradle to Enslave, I remember thinking, wow, doesn't Nick sound different? He seems to have done so. He's got more of a D-beat thing going on, this sort of thing. And I loved it. And then when I found out it was you,
No, sorry. No, that's funny because you mentioned the D-beat thing. There's one thing that I've never been able to do properly is a classic D-beat. And I remember when I was in ENT, I tried to sort of work it out, and I'm like, that's it, isn't it? And Dean would be like, no, that's not it. So the Slayer beat, the old Lombardo, I'm fine with. And I played that differently to Nick, and I always thought that I played it better than Nick. I'm not saying I'm better than Nick in any other way, but that. He was always a bit too quick on the triplet with the feet, in my opinion. But yeah, it's weird because it's I mean, good. I mean, I like the fact that was something, it was fresh for them. It was something new for them. And obviously they went on with Adrian, and I love Adrian. Adrian's fantastic.
Yeah,
sorry,
Adrian. No, it's all good, man. Talk anytime. There's no worries whatsoever. Yes, I like to say these aren't interviews, mate. These are conversations. That's important. A very important distinction. I've had to explain to a few listeners, especially to those Cradle of Filth chronicles, as I call them, that they're not interviews. They're conversations. We go wherever the conversation takes us. Okay, so wherever you want to take it, go for it. The Atlas is our playground, so to speak, in that respect.
Brilliant. Awesome.
I feel like as though your exit was a sliding doors moment for the group, okay, because you were there at a time when the group splintered, or certainly your tenure was, whether you're in the studio at the time when it happened
Both
or
times.
Not. Both times. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. The From the Cradle to Enslave, the splintering of the group that happened in From the Cradle to Enslave for an old fan like me was cataclysmic. Okay, because they went in a very different direction on MIDI, and I hear it. I know a lot of that, as I say, I know a lot of the people that have gotten to the band since year 2000. They think Midian is up here, but I mean, for me, I remember first hearing it and thinking, "What the hell's going on here?" You got the majesty of Cradle, then you've got this sub grinding shit on Midian. I've since come to appreciate it because I will never ever devalue Paul's contribution because he bloody carried that band for well over a decade.
Yeah. And that's really interesting. Sorry to interrupt, because when I left for the first time and they went on to do Principle, and then Paul, Ben and Paul, we all did the Blood Divine, they were so, they weren't bitter, but it was quite an acrimonious split. And Paul Allender was one of the most vocal about how he's, had it with them. And I can't remember the details of what was said, but, they were through. And then when the Blood Divine, Paul left the Blood Divine, and then we disbanded shortly after that. And then all of a sudden, Paul's back in Cradle, and all of those things that he said, and all of that was kind of by the by. And interestingly, you mentioned Midian. On the Midian tour, I played with a band called Christian Death, awesome. supporting Cradle. So I was back with Paul and Dan, and obviously the Midian lineup. And I remember, we just spent like 3 years in a band together. And I remember I didn't really talk to Paul much. He was just like, yeah, it's really good to be playing the old stuff again. I'm like, okay, cool. Well, you fucking hated it when we were in the Blood Divine. But I'm not slagging him off at all, because, you in those days, it was a case of, he just wanted to play, and he's a phenomenal guitar player, absolutely phenomenal guitar player. And I think that's the crux of it, is he's got such a talent, and it's just, you just need to try and channel that in the best way that he could. And he did, because he did a fair few records with Cradle after that. So, but yeah, sorry, I got you mid question again. Sorry, mate.
No dramas. Honestly, there's no worries whatsoever. It's just a thrill to catch up and to gain your insight into these things. I mean, there's some great detail there you've just provided. But I mean, when I talk about Cataclysmic, the issue here is that Of Dark Blood and Fucking, the tune written by Stewart, he's told me that was the direction, that was the song that was meant to be on the next Cradle of Filth album, which was going to be a Clive Barker concept album. Okay, so it was going to be a completely different beast, potentially with you on drums moving forward. It would have been that old 90s crew. It might have had a couple of albums in it after that, but of course it went in a very different direction. So that was the one song on the EP that you didn't play on. Adrian was drafted into play. So can you recall the story around why you weren't on that track?
I went in, we did the title track, we did the 2 covers. At the time of recording, it was just going to be that. It was just going to be those 3 songs. And then when it came out, they'd added a demo version of one song. I can't remember which song it was. I can't remember the demo version of Dark Blood and Fucking, and another song. So it was more of an EP. But at the time we recorded that, I don't think there was any talk of it being more than those 3 songs. Okay. And certainly with the songs that were added, I was not aware of those songs at all.
Yeah, it's a weird EP in that it has some of the band's greatest material on it, given Of Dark Blood and Fucking and From the Cradle to Enslave are on there, and also the cover, the Anathema cover. I've spoken to one of the Kavanagh brothers about that tune. But it was a situation. And then right at the end, you've got a Funeral in Carpathia, like a demo version or something. Yeah. Nick was not happy that was on there at all, I remember, or Nick or Stuart, one of the two. Yeah.
Well, see, this is the other thing was I remember hearing the original version of Dusk, not the version that everyone knows and loves now, but I remember hearing Dusk and Her Embrace with the principal lineup, the version that didn't see the light of day. And it just it blew my fucking mind, because it was the most technical, most intricate music. And obviously the whole thing with Cacophonous imploded. But I remember Queen of Winter, Throne that's on Vampire, the version that was on that tape, because it was only on a B-side of a 90-minute tape that Paul Ryan had. I was like, man, this is fucking incredible. And, that music was just literally the most... if that had come out at the time, as was planned, it would have been a totally different... I mean, hey, they're not exactly unsuccessful. But yeah, I think that would have really blew things completely out of the water,
Yeah, well, the From the Cradle to Enslave EP, it just seemed to be, even the video Pandemonium,
Yeah.
It just to me, looking back, it was a missed opportunity because it could have launched the band in, as I say, in an entirely different direction. The video, the reason I say the video is a missed opportunity is because half of it's that bloody behind the scenes stuff, and the behind the scenes stuff is not that interesting. Let's face it. And I mean, it's the video itself it's okay. You know, it's a bit of horror noir with a bit of porno shit thrown in. You know, but it doesn't stand the test of time, to be honest with you. When you look back on it. I
wasn't involved in the video. I do you know what? Looking back on it, I think it was a classic case of they signed to Music for Nations. I think they put out. I mean, what was the first MFN release? I think it was Dusk, wasn't it? I don't know. You know
yeah,
better.
Definitely. Yeah, the second version with Stewart on it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it was a case of look, we need something to for the stopgap. So do an EP, and then we'll do the next record. I think it was a bit of. You know, they had to put something out to keep the wheels churning, as it were. You know.
Mm. Yeah. What did Stu tell me? What did Stu tell me? He told me someone opened their fucking trap, and someone must have said something to the record company. And the record company said, "That's a great idea." Now he didn't say whether it was Danny or not, but I couldn't imagine it would be anybody else.
Well, who knows? And like I say, I mean, I always liked Stuart. Stuart was always a moody guy, but in a nice way. And it was imperative that him and Dan sometimes didn't see eye to eye. And when I came in, I mean, thinking about that, the Cradle to Enslave, we had Rob. I've known Rob. Well, I haven't spoken to Rob for about 20 years, but that's another story. I kind of grew up with Rob. And obviously we had John or Jan.
Yes.
On the other guy, who's an absolute, what a great guy, but a lunatic. And we had Stuart. And you know, when him and Dan weren't, they weren't seeing eye to eye for that whole time, and it was a bit weird looking back on it. Oh, we had Les as well. I love Les. Les, what a fucking great bloke Les is. Again, haven't seen him for a while, and I only really saw him when I did that. You know, I only really got to know him then.
Well, I think Stu, Nick, and Les, for an old fan like me, they're more or less the soul of the band, but because of the way that Dusk sounded on tour, because I saw them in 1997 when they came out, and of course Cruelty, and then From the Cradle to Enslave. But look, you mentioned Robin in there. Okay, so you haven't spoken to him in decades, but tell me about your relationship with Robin. How did you first meet Robin? And obviously he was he was part of the reason, I think, why you were able to come into Cradle.
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, yes and no, in the sense that the first person I met from that whole circle I was at college with Paul Ryan, and I had my death metal band. He had his death metal band, Cradle of Filth. I thought he was a poser, pretender, lovely guy, but I'm like, no one knows more about death metal than me. Come on, are you serious? We're in Ipswich. And he lent me the demo. It was fucking brilliant. And it went from there. And I saw him and Dan like local hardcore gigs here. So I knew of them. So we go back a long way. I've known those guys since I was 15. And Rob used to play in a thrash band here, Ipswich, called Malicious Intent. And I was in another thrash band called Cardinal Sin. So we were like in two rival kind of thrash bands. And it's just, the scene in Ipswich in that time was just it was really good. Really good. There was always a band to go and see maybe not every night, but certainly every weekend. So we kind of grew up going through the ranks. And then I can't remember how he got the gig in Cradle now. I honestly don't know. Because John was playing, a guy called John Pritchard was the original bass player. Mm-hmm. Nice guy. I think that I said, I know a guy who plays bass, get Rob in to play bass. I think, because I can't think how else it would have worked in the sense that he didn't know the Ryan brothers. Well, at the time, Ben wasn't in the band, and he didn't know that side of, the Hadley crew.
Yep.
But I don't want to go on record saying that because that might be that's just how my brain's working at the moment. So yeah, we just played in loads of bands together. And then of course the December Moon thing came about, which was essentially, him writing all the music, and then we rehearsed and did the album. But yeah, no, I have a lot of respect for Rob. A very talented guy. Again, he's another one that if that talent had been nurtured properly and effectively, I think, he would have been, I don't know what he's doing now, but, it would have been a different story. It's a shame, really.
He's, for such a huge presence, he's kind of a shadowy figure in the band's history, isn't he? Because I remember Nick told me that he felt that he didn't know how to tie up his shoelaces and stuff. So there's obviously there's conflict in any band. God knows I've been in enough of them my bloody self to know that they can be very, very difficult and interesting places to be in at the best of times. And you're just trying to get to either the end of a rehearsal or even worse, at the end of your bloody gig, just make it through intact without murdering one another at the end of it because of the mistakes that are made and even just people's attitude on stage or what have you. So there should never be any judgment on that front, especially if people are referring to comments, drawing on their memory and making comments on their memory, But for such an enormously talented group that was producing, you mentioned Paul Ryan there. Gosh knows I've tried to contact him a few times after having a chat with Ben, but it seems
I can hook you up.
Oh, brother, that would be magnificent if you could, yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm sure he wouldn't mind because after the falling out again, him and Dan and the old label manager of Cacophonous, the guy called Neil, don't remember his surname, they re-released what did they re-release? Something recently?
The Dusk and Her Embrace, the original Sin version.
Yeah. So that on paper, years ago, that was never going to happen, because they were all like, "Oh, fucking Neil ripped us off" or whatever. And to have those three, I remember seeing the photo of Paul and Dan in the same room. I would never have put that together. There was, especially between Paul and Nick as well. There's a lot of shit there. And again, I knew this would happen. So if I go into one about that, I'll tell you what not to put in. But yeah, fucking hell.
Yeah, but dysfunction seems to be the law, but talent seems to be the rule. Okay, so all like Robin's contribution, the December Moon album's great, fantastic stuff, and it's like, and then it just poof disappeared, and then he went back into Cradle, obviously. So with the December Moon thing, was there ever an opportunity to sort of follow up on that, or was it just going to be like a one-time deal, just something you did?
It was difficult because Rob was in Cradle at the time, and I was in the Blood Divine at the time, and towards the end of it, Extreme Noise Terror as well. So it wasn't just a question of me and Rob getting together and making an album. It was a question of, well, Rob's signed to Music for Nations. I was signed to Peaceville Stroke, then which morphed into Music for Nations, and it was very difficult to find middle ground. So it was just for that one album. We did always want to do a second album, and it never transpired. And then we lost contact, and he moved away from Ipswich. So, but yeah, so it was difficult. It was tricky at the time because on the on Damage 381. It says that I appear courtesy of Music for Nations, which they had to, MFN insisted on that. And it was funny because I remember being at MFN and Andy Black, the guy that worked there, was like, well, we heard that December, what a bloody brilliant album. We'd be interested in that. We'd be interested if you guys want to do another album. And that was like, well, yeah, that'd be great because we're on MFN in different bands anyway. But again, it never materialized. And that was right around the time of Rob was doing Cruelty, and it just never materialized.
Life has other plans, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. What's your take on Danny's role in the studio when you were there recording? Because from what I understand, Stuart was really at the helm of the band at that time, certainly around the music. Danny, this has been said repeatedly across the interviews, Danny doesn't write music. He comes in after that's done. So from your perspective, the music was being written. Did Danny come over and say anything to you about your performance?
No. He would, in the rehearsal studio, it was just a question of, and again, I'm trying to go back in time and remember, we were just left to get on with it. And You're right. Stuart was, the guy that would be like, no, do that there, and then do that there, and then we'll do this. And Dan would just kind of hover. He'd contribute if he felt he needed to, but in the studio, it was kind of left to us workmen, But he was never like, lording it up like some kind of maestro. He was always just Dan. And that's the thing. That's the difficulty that it's different for me. Because like I said, we were 15-year-old kids going to Obituary and Autopsy and all these great, we were kids in the scene, and we kind of, so he wouldn't ever come to me and be like, oh, I think maybe if I'd have stayed in the band and had a longer time with him, he probably would have done over time. But there was never that like, right, not being funny, da 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 da. It was all, we all still had the same relationship. And even to this day, when I see him around, it's just people that are two guys that have known each other for a long time.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah.
But he was never tyrannical or anything like that. The only time I remember him being a bit like that was when we were playing pubs. Literally, I remember it's a fucking Audi. Do you have Audi in Australia?
Yep. Yeah, they're everywhere. Well, yeah.
There's a lovely pub just down in Whitton. It's called the Safe Harbour, and Cradle played there a couple of times. And I remember we had played with this band called Shocker, and they were shocking, like proper heavy metal, and that was with the hair and everything. And there was an argument as to who was going to go on last, who was going to headline. And I remember Dan saying, well, we're fucking signed. We should go on last. This is a joke. And I remember him standing on a can as he did it, and he fell flat on his ass. That's the only time that I remember him ever having that kind of like, well, that kind of ego thing.
Yeah.
Obviously, when he's had a few drinks, he could be a knob, and that's why he gets, it's the reputation of, I met Dan in a club, he's a fucking dick. But, we're all the same, aren't we?
Mm-hmm.
In the sense that, putting myself in his position, I'm not surprised, because you get all these knobs coming up to you sometimes, especially in Ipswich back in the day. You used to get all sorts of people coming up to him, and they all want to chat to him, and that was before the whole camera phone thing, and but yeah. So no, I can't say anything bad about Dan, because he hasn't ever done anything that I've thought, oh my God, what a dick, And if he did, I would be able to actually, you know what? There is a fucking story, and that was on the Midian tour with Christian Death, where he was on our bus and he was larruped, he was fucked, and he spilt wine in, I can't remember whose bunk it was.
Oof. Yeah.
But he was, I was like, Dan, you just spilt fucking wine in so-and-so's bunk. And he was really apologetic. And, the next day he came and sorted it all out, and he was like, I'm sorry. And I think that had that have been, someone from, I don't know, the crew, or someone that was part of his entourage, I don't think it would have been dealt with the respect that he did with in that situation. But yeah, I'm digressing. I'm sorry.
No, it's all important stuff, mate. It's all part of the fabric of the band's history, if you like. But it is interesting, though, isn't it? He's the one tenured member over the past. It's getting into 32 years, I think, now, isn't it? 1991. So, so 32 years. He's the one consistent individual across that. There's been something in the vicinity. If you include touring members, not including touring members, it's over 40 tenured members, so people that have appeared in liner notes on the back of albums if you buy the physical product or what have you, or if you go to Wikipedia.
Some of them didn't even exist. Jared Demeter never existed. Yeah. You did know that.
I knew that.
Yeah.
What?
I think they got a photo of Robert and made it those longer. But the thing is, Andrew, that for Cradle to work, and indeed for a lot of metal bands to work, they need that figurehead. So you take the figurehead away, you take Dan out of the equation. What have you got? You need Dan to be the spokesperson and the voice, and indeed, creatively, he's second to none. Lyrically, absolutely brilliant. And I think that's the crux of it. in the sense that he's always been very, very protected by, record labels, because they know that it could be Danny in the Filth, right? Because it doesn't really matter who's playing drums. It doesn't really matter who's playing bass. As long as you've got that figurehead. And I think that's partly why he's lasted so long. Not because, and I'm not disrespecting his passion and his commitment and, his drive, because that is obviously there for all to see. But I think just the way that the whole thing's set up, that he has to, without him, there's no band. Simple as that.
From what I gather, Faye's influence over the band after Cruelty, it became huge. Okay, and this is me speculating and joining pieces of jigsaw puzzle, the conversational jigsaw puzzle pieces together. The opportunity, Marilyn Manson was huge at the time. We all remember 1998, 1999, Mechanical Animals, very different album to Antichrist Superstar, but it was very much, you saw both album covers, the Antichrist and the Mechanical Animals thing, both had Marilyn on front. It was after that explosion, if you like, and the success of Cruelty, you started seeing merch just with Danny on the front. Danny's head. That wasn't around before. And I remember, because I've been into the group since 1996. So I remember, and I had the merch through the, I can't remember the merchandising company that they set up, but I had all of the really ornate merchandise. Wish I still had it. But it seemed like there was a real drive, and I understand that it comes from Faye, to put Danny smack bang in the middle. And part of the reason behind that was to sort of capitalise on the success of the Marilyn Manson thing. Is that? Do you think I'm on track with that? With those thoughts?
I think that's a fair. I think they're fair comments. In terms of from a business point of view, it makes sense, and particularly because there were so many lineup changes. If I was doing Faye's job, that's probably exactly what I would do, because then you protect your product. Because if you've only got to look after one guy, make sure he's happy to run everything, then it doesn't matter if you've got a revolving door. So I would say you're pretty, I would agree with you. I think you're pretty, from my point of view, I think you're pretty much spot on. I've only ever spoken to Faye once on the phone, and that was that phone call where she was like, look, just learn the set, because it's going to go off with Nick.
Yeah.
That's the only dealing I've ever had with Faye. So
yeah,
I can't really comment more than that, but I would say that that's a pretty informed view. I think that's certainly what it looks like.
Well, again, I'm trying to have a conversation with her. I've reached out to her on LinkedIn, but look, you know how it is, and especially recently with Kit passing away, there's no way I'd ever impose. But if she ever listens to this, God bless her, and also Kit. But I'd love to have a conversation with her about these things, because she would know. She was there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think enough. I would gesture to say that enough water under the bridge has passed for her to give a kind of a no holds barred interview, and that's not you fishing for gossip or tabloid journalism. It's just about filling in the gaps for the people that are genuinely interested in what happened around those times. And it is interesting. I get why it's interesting, but yeah, I think that would be because no one really thinks about managers, do they? No one really sort of thinks, and she's probably got the best stories. She's probably got better stories than all of us.
Yeah, I reckon she'd be a wealth of a heap of those sort of things, and as I say, mate, she's on the bucket list, believe me, as is Mike Exeter and John Fryer as well, both of them as well. But there is one more member of the band I wanted to ask you your opinion about, and that's Sarah. Now, just before I get you to answer that, I have had email interactions with her. She will not talk about Cradle. She is black and white told me that it's done, it's over. She wasn't rude to me or anything like that, but she left me with no alternative view than to say that pursuing her for conversation about this was not going to happen unless she does a complete 180. So that said,
yes.
What's your perspective on Sarah?
I think Sarah's fucking awesome. I think she's brilliant. So again, I've only ever dealt with her when I knew her when she was in the band and I wasn't. And again, like on the Midian tour, she was doing the backups. I've always liked Sarah. I always got on. She's a proper Essex girl. You know, she's funny. And she was doing last time I spoke to her was in my house, and she was doing a solo album. She wanted me to come and play drums. And again, I wasn't, playing at that time. So yeah, that was the last time I spoke to her on the phone. She was talking about doing a Madonna cover, which I thought was quite novel. She's very talented. And I don't know what went on between her and the Cradle machine. But yeah, she kind of fell by the wayside. But as a person, she's awesome. She's brilliant.
Yeah, look, I've got my own theories there. And look, she's mentioned it, but she's alluded to there being issues from management with her weight. And if it is the case, how fucking ridiculous in metal, the one genre where you're free to be you. I mean, for God's sakes.
Yeah.
And the floating your head thing in the Midian video, it was ludicrous. She was just marginalised, wasn't she?
Well, I don't know, I don't know anything about that, but it wouldn't surprise me. But the thing is, the way she handles herself on stage, and the clothes that she wears are fantastic. And you don't think, oh my God, look, it's not, the weight thing doesn't even come into it. She's beautiful for how she was, and how she presented and how she sang. That's the most important thing. But the image thing was, I think, at that time really on point in terms of how the band members looked. Okay, maybe not Martin and maybe not Adrian either with all that PVC stuff.
Oh,
but
God,
in terms of her image with the band, I think it's always been pretty good. And if the weight thing was an issue for management, then you're right. It's absolutely pathetic. Rather than saying, right, okay, how do we make the band look great for this next video or this next show, whatever it is, to go down that route is ridiculous. But then, having said that, she's such a cool woman. I don't know why that she wouldn't just be like, yeah, I'll give you an interview. But hey, there's probably a lot of stuff that we don't know. So
yeah. Oh, look, she shared things, from the perspective that she really isn't happy with some of the members of the group, and she didn't want to go into, like, she would go to the point where she thinks she wanted to share stuff, but then she went, oh, I've gone too far, and then she'd pull back. And I'm like, well, there's always going to be respect here in so far as share whatever you want, however you want, okay? Which is why I didn't air Paul's comments when he asked me not to. I've never been about that bullshit tabloid side of things. I'm just an old fan having conversations with members of a killer band. And look, but I just, from even back then, you'd hear this beautiful voice on the album was crucial. Her and the young lady who was recently murdered by a bloody terrorist. Sorry, I can't remember her name now. Is it Martina? The other singer that was on the early stuff. Everybody's probably yelling at me saying, "You spoke about it with Ben." Yes, I did. I can't remember her name now.
I don't know how. I know that in the early days they would have Sarah singing, but the voice, the spoken word parts, female parts, were done by another woman, because bless Sarah's Essex drawl, just wouldn't work. But I remember there being another, I want to say Danielle.
Andrea.
I don't know why.
Andrea Meyer. So it was on the tip of my tongue. Yeah, Andrea Meyer.
I don't know.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I know that was a thing in the early days, but,
Yeah. But Sarah was a crucial part of the band's sound, but she was never in the photos. So, I did go to one meet and greet, one that they did on the back of Midian. So what's that, 2001? I think they were in Australia touring in that one there. And Sarah wasn't there then. And I remember thinking it was a little bit odd because she was certainly on stage. So I was like, she was a non-member of the band, but still participating in everything that a member would.
Yeah, it's strange. Now you mention it, it is strange. The only thing that I would put down to that is that she wasn't, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but she wasn't on every song. So a set, certainly in the earlier days, would only feature her like popping up here and there. So I don't know. I don't know why that wasn't, I don't know why that was a, maybe it was a management decision. I don't know.
Yeah, who knows on that one? Unless it comes from, one thing I will say, unless it comes from either Faye or Sarah, we'll never know 100% for sure.
Yeah.
You know, hey, I mentioned Mike Exeter. So he was brought back in after the relative failure of the production on Cruelty, something which I didn't hear at the time, I must confess. I thought the album, courtesy of the songs, just sounded brilliant. But you worked with Mike, you must have, because he was behind the desk, I think, when you were recording. So what was it like working with a fellow like Mike?
I can remember Mike Exeter, and there was another guy there. You probably know his name. Literally, Andrew, it's literally, Rob and I drove up to Liverpool. We got the stuff together. I set up, and I think everything was either done in a day or 2 days. I remember them being very nice guys. I remember them being very professional. And the other guys had worked with them before, so there was a bit of a rapport there that they had that I didn't. But that's about all I can say, to be honest. It's about all I can say.
Dan Spriggs.
They were very good.
The other fella. Yeah.
For 1 day, 2 days. So
yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I think he was crucial to the band's sound overall, because you can hear what later albums sound like, and I think John Fryer has been unfairly. Oh well, you know, when you really deep dive into it, but John Fryer is a legend. I mean, God Almighty, who hasn't he worked with? It's probably easy to put so, but just for people who don't know who he is, you know, he's done many albums with Depeche Mode. I'm not saying he's responsible for that sound, but he was around through them crafting an incredible career. 9 Inch Nails, he had Pretty Hate Machine. Okay, that revolutionised. God, everything was different after Pretty Hate Machine, wasn't it? But did you have anything to do with John at all, or was that
no? Nothing to do with him at all.
Jesus, it sounded magnificent though, didn't it? From the Cradle to the song though. When you heard it, were you just like, oh my God, listen to that?
Yeah, and you know what it was? It was Stuart. It was Stuart's riff. You know, that main riff with the little guitar melody. I knew that it was a massive riff. And Stuart, I mean, again, in terms of what he did on Cruelty, the fucking riffs. Now, this is the other thing, Andrew, that you need to. When I was in Cradle first time round, I was proper death metal all the way. So when this black metal stuff started coming around, okay, we put the face paint on and stuff, but I was very much in the camp of this new stuff, you know, Emperor, Burzum, Dark Throne. It wasn't what I considered black metal. Black metal to me was Venom, you know, Early Frost, Merciful Fate, Bathory, Hellhammer. And I didn't really like or get into this trend of, you know, this second wave of black metal. And I really couldn't connect with it. Certainly not in the same way that everyone else did. Other guys in the band did. Obviously, they were right to embrace that wave. But you know, sorry, what was it? What was the question? Sorry, I'm rambling again.
Oh no,
I got there from.
Oh, we're just talking about how I just love the sound. You know, we're talking about John Fryer, and you've answered the question by talking about the riff, which is killer, because I agree with you. You know, I mean, without a killer riff, listen to those old Bathory albums, like the first Bathory album, and you know, you know, In League with Satan, these sort of albums. I mean, you listen to them, they sound, to be honest, they sound like shit, but they don't, because of the riffs that are on there, and people forget that metal is about the riff.
Yeah. Exactly, and that was the real focal part of that song. I knew that it was. I knew that whatever they did had to be significant at that time. So it was. I knew what I was doing was going to be like lauded, you know. So yeah, it was the riff that did it. I knew that the riff made the song. So
you mentioned. You had some positive things to say about John, and I've got to say, given my many conversations with the older members, that's rare. Your take on John is that he's a hilarious fella, but did you see him contribute much in the studio?
I think as much as anyone else. I don't. Obviously, we did one song and two covers, so he would always be larking around, always be, the funny guy, for want of a better description. But did he contribute much? I think he did. Yeah, I think it would be unfair to say that he didn't contribute. I certainly remember him throwing suggestions in, and the good thing about John is that when we were rehearsing that song, we obviously played it over and over again to try and iron things out before going to the studio. And John would always be, Papa giving it metal face and, trying to, get into it. Whereas Stuart would just be there with his fag hanging out of his mouth, just playing what was required, because he obviously thought, well, I just want to go home or whatever. But yeah, no, I think John contributed as much as anyone else. Whether he wrote as much pound for pound, I wouldn't like to comment, but certainly when on the Midian tour, he just did his thing, and he did it well. He was, I think John's awesome. I wonder where he is now. I think he moved to Canada or something. I don't know. I haven't seen him in years.
Yeah, that's what I heard. Yeah, that's what I heard. He seems to have dropped off the radar completely, and believe me,
I think what we do, isn't it?
Yeah, well, look, I've tried to see if he's on LinkedIn or something, but I mean, given the fact that he goes by, well, he's known as John, but his name is Gian and this sort of thing, God knows where he's ended up and what he's doing. But it seems to me like as though he's just left the music industry completely, and he must be leading an everyday life like we are,
Yeah, I know he was big into like computing and IT and stuff, and I did hear a rumor that he was working in that realm. Possibly something to do with computer games. I don't know. But hey, fair play to him. Nice guy. He was always really cool to me. He was always really cool to everyone. And I think he did a tour with Christian Death after he left.
Yes.
Like a run around Europe. So,
yeah,
lovely bloke.
Yeah, there you go. Hey, look, I'll finish by talking about Extreme Noise Terror. I mentioned up top, I'm fascinated with your tenure in the group, because it was this, for people who don't know, Extreme Noise Terror, this is a group that collaborated with KLF during the British Music Awards and stuff. They had an enormous impact there for a very short period of time on the psyche, certainly the British psyche. Very subversive outfit. I love the group, I've got to say. And I've had a chat to Barney about the album Damage 381, which coincidentally you're on as well. So Barney is the singer. Everybody knows him as a singer for Napalm Death, but he wasn't for a period of time. He was actually the singer for Extreme Noise Terror. And Phil Vane jumped into Napalm Death. And I remember when it happened thinking, after Diatribes, I thought again, sorry, just to repeat myself, I'd spoken to Barney about it because I wanted to know if the reaction to Diatribes was so bad, because I remember the reaction to Diatribes from Napalm Death had forced him out. And he more or less said, look, I wanted to keep on going the grind route, but the other guys wanted to do this Sonic Youth sort of influenced music. And it may have put, he didn't say whether it was or it wasn't, but I think the inference was clear that, they weren't really getting along and seeing eye to eye musically at the very least. He went into Extreme Noise Terror, Phil Vane into Napalm Death. Nothing happened with Napalm Death, but Extreme Noise Terror came out with this killer album that you're on, Damage 381. So what's your take on that episode of your musical career?
Right, so I grew up going to ENT shows here in Ipswich as a young kid. Literally, I was at high school. We'd go to, incredible bills back then, Extreme Noise Terror, Bolt Thrower, Carcass, Napalm. So I literally grew up seeing, that was when they were proper hardcore, UK hardcore punk. So I can't remember how they rehearsed. ENT used to rehearse at the same place that Cradle rehearsed, a studio called Springvale Studios on the outskirts of Ipswich. And I think it was Rob again. Rob's like, ENT are looking for a drummer. I'm like, cool. So I went in and I auditioned because obviously, of course I'm going to audition. It's fucking Extreme Noise Terror. Of course I am. So the first thing that I do when I go in, I set my drums up. Did I use my kit? Yeah, I think I did. Yeah. and the first thing that I see is a McDonald's carton on the floor. But it wasn't just discarded; it was there, right? I'm like, what's that about? You know, knowing their history and their politics. I was vegetarian for 19 years because I grew up with the hardcore scene. So to go into an Extreme Noise Terror audition and find a fucking McDonald's carton there, I had some questions. So I'm like, what's that about? And Dean, in his inimitable way, was like, oh, we don't give a fuck about any of that now. I'm like, okay, cool. I don't really care either. So anyway, I got the gig, and they were. I look back on the album with fond memories because they're just it was just ridiculous. But as a drummer, I was doing an album on Earache Records, which I grew up. Some of my favorite albums are the classic Earache albums from the late 80s, early 90s. I literally. Yeah, absolutely. Always a Madness, Realm of Chaos, Symphonies of Sickness, Mentally Murdered, all the Napalm stuff. I could go on for ages. That's literally my childhood. That is what I was. That's my Terrorizer. That's my stuff. So to do an album on Earache with a band that I grew up loving was a no-brainer. But the problem with that was that as it was Dean and Ali who were they were the band there. And there was a guy called Lee Barrett on bass. Mm-hmm. So Lee Barrett on bass, you say Lee Barrett to someone, people are like, who? But Lee Barrett actually started Candlelight Records, signed Emperor, discovered Emperor, and toured with, was the man who put together the Cradle and Emperor Fear of a Black Metal Planet tour in this country. Mm-hmm. So he's, that guy is responsible for giving Emperor to the world. So he was on bass. And the music that ENT were writing at that time was just stuff that to me, it was really out of date. It's fantastic that a bunch of crusties like ENT were embracing it, but they really should have done it when Napalm did it 10 years before. I remember some of the riffs that they were writing, and it was difficult for me to swallow because these were recycled Carcass riffs that really didn't have much impact, in my opinion. And I think that it would have served them better to have taken their original ethos and just given it a bit more of a modern sort of sound. So if you can imagine some of their early recordings, but with a more modern, polished production like Demonstrate One's got. So yeah, it was weird for me. And of course, at that time, I was doing the Blood Divine thing, which was taking off slightly more. So I kind of had to say, look, I can't do this anymore. And it was never really, they were so all over the place in terms of, everything, that it was never really anything more than that. So yeah.
Yeah. What was it like working with Barney?
Well, funny thing is, I when we recorded Demonstrate One, I didn't work with Barney. The only time I did anything with Barney was when he came down to do the press photos.
Oh, really?
And he's a lovely bloke. That's the only time.
Yeah.
And the whole Phil thing was really weird because I remember Phil being around a little bit at the start of and then all of a sudden he was like, well, I got the Napalm. And I was like, well, cool, man, nice one. But I never really knew how that was going to work. And I don't think it worked out particularly well. And then Phil came back to the God rest his soul. I love that guy. He was a really, such a nice bloke and such a, I don't know. He was massive in the local scene, and I think that it was never really destined to work out with him and Napalm or with Barney and ENT. The best way I can put it is like that. I mean, both bands literally swapped for a matter of months and then swapped back. It was weird. And hey, I tell you what, even though I'm not a massive fan of the later Napalm stuff, I saw them I mean, it's years ago now because of COVID and everything, but we saw them with Obituary, and I've seen him a couple of times. And fucking Barney's awesome on stage. He's really good. He's really found his own niche, you know. And when he joined the band after Lee Dorian and Bill left, as a fan at the time, I was like, whoa, what the fuck is this? But he's really carved out his own niche, and Napalm are a real force in themselves. You know, they've always been a force, but, you know, Harmony Corruption, and it just, I don't know, it didn't really work at the time, but they've plowed through it, and fair play to them.
Yeah, again, I was around back then, and I remember I thought the album was great, but the band members didn't really like it. And Barney actually told me that he wouldn't change anything, but it wasn't something to hoist up on a flag there. But the other thing about Barney is he was in Benediction as well. So
yeah, I fucking love that. I love Subconscious Terror. That's probably my favorite Barney output. You know, it's a horrible production. Mick Harris produced it, and it's a shitty cover, and but yeah, you know, that to me, that's my childhood. You know what I mean? I remember, you know. Brilliant. You
got to have albums that sound like that from back then, though. That was the era.
Yeah, you did. And I think the whole the reason it was the whole Napalm thing was difficult for me, because when I first heard Napalm Death and the Peel session, and then Scum, and that classic lineup, for them to all of a sudden change overnight and start wearing, you know, Death shirts and joggers, and to go to Morrisound and have that real polished, horrible production, but a real polished sound. It's a complete antithesis of what they were, and it was difficult for me to swallow at the time. But yeah,
they're not a Morrisound band at all. But they did it once. No.
But Mass Appeal Madness followed Harmony Corruption, and that's killer.
Yeah,
that was Barney finding his feet. Mick Harris, you know, raw production, a bit more of the old style. And I thought that was fantastic.
Look, I'll finish up by asking you, look, you really were. We've talked about your tenure in two very prominent, very important bands, it must be said. You discussed too how you live within the proximity of all of these magnificent musicians. You're one of them, mate. But do you look?
Oh, thanks.
Do you look back and do you feel as though there was a sliding doors moment where life could have unfolded very differently?
Not really. I don't have any regrets. I made the choices that I made at the time, and I don't have any regrets. I remember, I mean, not really metal related, but the band that I was playing with prior to my retirement, there was just so much bullshit, you know, with record companies and no offense, journalists, and all of this charade of bullshit. I just thought, I've had enough. And what I wanted to do, I wanted to be normal. My brother would phone me up and say, look, we're going into town, come. And I couldn't, because I had to go to London to rehearse or something. And I really hated the whole uncertainty and how disheveled my life was. I wanted to just have a base. I wanted to start a family. I wanted to be normal and go to work, come back, get paid. I genuinely craved that. And that's exactly what I did. I had a couple of children, and I enjoy my work, which obviously takes up most of my time now. And I'd made that conscious decision. And and the other records that we haven't talked about is the Deinonychus records, which have just been remastered and re-released by Andy LaRocque from King Diamond, which blew my mind. So those are two records that I really hold in high esteem, because they're ridiculously heavy. And at the time of making them, I was like, oh, this is just so fun. I can't get my head around it. But looking back now, blows my mind. But yeah, to answer your question, no, I don't really believe in any of that. I think that if I'd have, there's a chance I could be still playing in bands and being successful, but there's also a very high chance that I'd still be playing in bands and just plugging away, trying to work out where my next paycheck was coming from and doing anything that would come my way.
Yeah, that's interesting. But with the Deinonychus albums, I can certainly see that it's an entry in your catalogue, if you like, or your resume. But Andy LaRoque, that's a pretty serious person to have come along and actually do some work with you. How did all that happen?
Fuck knows. We did those albums at the turn of the century, so 2000 and 2001, I think, or might have been 99, I don't know. But I literally, Marco messaged me and said, hey, look, they're all being re-released. Andy LaRoque is remastering them all, repackaged, new covers. Everything's on Spotify now and Apple Music. And yeah, fantastic. Because like I said, I look back on those records as being real. I really, because the way they were recorded was very unique, because he would send over a cassette of his guide guitars to a click track.
Yep.
And literally I would make stuff up over the top of them. So I would write all of the parts. There's a couple of parts where he would say, right, that bit's silent, don't play on that part. Apart from that, I was left to my own device. And then I'd fly out to Holland, set my drums up, play to the same tape in the studio, and he would be surprised because he'd have an idea of what I would be playing. But of course, I didn't play what he thought I was going to play. And then, the music took shape from there. So it's a really unique way of recording.
Yeah.
I look back on those with fond memories. And I think that they're definitely that's definitely the darkest music I've ever been involved in. So
glad to hear it's on Spotify. If it's not on Spotify these days, you're basically hidden.
That's the other. Sorry to bang on, Andrew, but that's the other thing. I mean, nowadays, in my day, it was a case of you do a demo, you send it to a record company, you get signed, you go from there. Nowadays, you need record companies won't even give you a look in unless you've got X amount of followers on Facebook.
Correct.
or a TikTok following. That to me is just such a, I don't want to sound like an old man, but it's such an alien world. And I can't imagine being a struggling musician in 2022. It's great from a band's perspective in the sense that you can own everything and put it all on your website and sell it and make all of the profit. But you've got to get people to your website. You've got to get people to those gigs. So I can't even imagine doing it nowadays.
It's really like that as a writer, mate. The publishers won't talk to you unless you've got a 5-figure following on Facebook. It's fucking stupid. But you're like, well, how
ridiculous?
How on earth? I mean, this isn't the be all and end all. Plus, I can go and buy for about $200. I can go and buy 10,000 followers. You idiots! I mean, there's so many ways of gaming the system, but I just don't do it. I couldn't be bothered. What's the point?
But you know what? What's the point? But I think the way you're doing it will prevail, and I think that if I was still a musician, I think that I would do it the way that, the old school way. And I think that if it's any good and if there is some substance to it, it will come good. I think that there is still, some integrity in being, just doing your own thing for your own reasons, because like you say, you could, if you did do that, you wouldn't be you wouldn't be representing you'd just be this facade, and it's not about that.
I think you've just been smart too, if I can make that observation. I mean, what you've talked about, you could be talking about my life there, where you made a decision that you wanted a proper job, you wanted to have a family. These are all things that I had listed as goals when I was a young fella. Thank God I've been able to go down that route. The idea that everybody can sort of lead the life that Lemmy lived, because we all know intimate details about Lemmy's life these days, courtesy of the amount that bloody Rolling Stone and those fuckhead magazines have written about him. Yeah. And you read it and think, man, that's a one-off. That guy was cast from a very different die. The rest of us, mate, if you're not careful, you'll end up on welfare and potentially in a position where you can't recover financially. And as Jordan Peterson talks about, there's the spiral into hell. Broken relationships, not having proper relationships, broken relationships with spouses, not having proper relationships with your own children, and God knows whatever else is going on in your own family. But you've got to put in as much effort into that often as you do into the music. It's not just about the music.
No, it isn't. It isn't. It's And like I said earlier about the whole black metal thing coming into the scene, that was something that I couldn't relate to. And music changes all the time. So to having to, if, looking at it from Dan's point of view, again, I mean, they've always kind of done their own thing, but they've still had to recognize current trends and, what was, they had to keep current. And that whole aspect of keeping up with the times was something that, I always kind of struggled with. And I think that would be such pressure, and like I said, there's something to be said for stability. And once, I mean, the main thing that appealed to me when I was a musician was seeing the world and touring. But touring's fantastic when there's a certain budget behind the band that you're playing with. If there's no budget behind the band you play, it's fucking shit.
Awful. Yeah.
Because you live back in the band and, nobody's looking after you. But when it's slightly a higher level than that, it's fucking wonderful. But yeah, no, like I say, I needed I needed stability. I wanted to, it's almost like, right, that phase of my life's done now. Let's do something else now, And sometimes I sit here and sometimes I see bands come around and I think, I'd love to get into something again. So I'm never saying never. I'm not adverse to doing something again, but it has to be right. And this time it's on my terms. But what that looks like, I don't know. If it looks like anything, I don't know.
Yeah, well,
we'll see.
At least you've done all of the right things with your life, I can tell you, mate, I've spoken to musicians who have a lot of deep regrets. They're in their late 40s. I'm 44, but I can sense it, mate. I'm just glad that I made the decisions that I have made. A lot of the musicians,
totally.
Spending time in pubs and on tour vans and stuff is pretty cool when you're in your 20s, maybe your 30s, but when you're in your 40s, it's just, and you don't have anything to fall back on, and you want that
exactly,
and that's something that you want, mate. I mean, it's very hard to sort of start over again when you're in your late 40s.
I mean, I can't imagine not having, as you said, something to fall back on. I like going out and having a good time and doing whatever, going to gigs, but I love the fact that I'm so, lovely, I'm going to go home and, if I'm up past 10, I like to go to bed. I've got my routine. I've got, if I've got a day off, then I like my afternoon naps. I'm a simple guy, I've got no interest in doing any of that now. So it's weird, but yeah, no regrets. I mean, I just think, and it's difficult when you talk to people, certainly people that aren't in the scene or aren't into, just know the Cradle thing, and they can't get their heads around it. And they think that, why would you not? It's like, well, it's really not as easy as that. It's not like we're all on fucking, X amount of pounds a month. It really isn't like that. And they don't they don't factor in all the shit that comes with playing in the band. They don't factor any of that in. So
yeah,
they just see the name, think that it's, all glamour and fucking champagne and cocaine. It's really not. It's just bollocks.
Yeah, well, Paul Allender's the one who has the story around this sort of stuff. Maybe not the cocaine and champagne, maybe, but maybe not. But the whole idea of staying in a band for as long as what he did and then getting to the end of that road and then, looking at your options, that's something that when he's ready to tell that story, I've told him, listen, whether you want to do it, because I write books, as I mentioned, whether you want to do it via a biography, ghostwriting, help you ghostwrite a biography, or you want to do it more of a documentary style, or just even a whole series of conversations like what we're doing here, in addition to the one we've already done, I'd love to help him with that, because he has the story that I think a lot of young musicians, I mean, I'll preface what I'm about to say by saying I simply cannot understand if it was sort of on the way out when you and I were coming through and you actually did it, okay, and I tried to do it. The whole idea that you could join a band, get a deal, boom, you're in the next Led Zeppelin, this sort of thing, or the next Faith No More, or whatever it might be. it was on the way out when you and I were coming through, but in 2022 to hear people talk like that, and they're still out there, 19, 20, up to 25 years of age. My only advice for them is, Jesus Christ, you better grow up, and you better grow up quick, son, because the music industry isn't really an industry, it's a meat grinder.
Yeah, it is. It is, absolutely. And it's even more of a meat grinder now because, do you know what, though? I mean, I'm just trying to think of all the tools that bands have got at their disposal now, you know, Instagram, TikTok. I'm just trying to think that fuck that. Seriously, fuck that.
These days, all of the bands have all of these tools available. I even find it as a podcaster. I mean, I've got killer conversations with you, a killer conversation now with yourself to share with people. That cuts through because nobody else is really doing a lot of that stuff. But even my conversations with other members of bands, whether it be Megadeth or what have you, look at the numbers, they're not there. Because these people, they go on these press junkets and boom, and I mean, I'm not even. And look, I can tell you, I've earned nothing doing this. I'm not trying to earn money doing it. It's purely for the love and for the passion that I do this. Yeah. You know, I've got a job, like we say, in the day and day job, and you know, I'm a scout leader and all of this sort of stuff as well. So I've got a pretty well-rounded life, but this is my hobby. And I think people have got to sort of look at it that way. And I think your tale, above any more than anybody else in the group that I've spoken to, sort of highlights that.
Yeah, the ideal is to have the full-time job, the revenue, and then do the band stuff on top of that. But that's difficult to do when you're 20-something. And then one takes over the other, because you can't go into work and say, you know what, I can't come in next week because we've got 3 or 4 dates to do. It doesn't work like that. So either you need to be slumming it at home with your parents as a youngster, or you need to be, you know, financially equipped to do it. It's one of those things, though, isn't it? I mean, like I say, I'm grateful for the things that I've done. I'm grateful for the experiences that I've had, and the people that I've met. You know, but I like this. Things like this are fantastic because I like talking about it. You know, and I think that there's loads of there's so many different little tales, kind of spring. Thank you for the opportunity, to speak about.
Well, thank you very much, brother. Truly appreciate it.
No worries.
Thanks, bro.
Nice one. Been a pleasure. Have a good day.
You too, mate. No worries. Enjoy your evening. Well, there he is, ladies and gentlemen. Was Sarginson. I really appreciate that he was willing to have a chat for the show. If you like that one, and if you're unfamiliar, go across to scarsandguitars.com, click on the link at the top of the page that says Cradle of Filth Conversations, and you can hear me talk to Stuart Anstis, Nick Barker, Greg Moffat aka Damien Gregori, Lindsay Schoolcraft, Danny Filth, Richard Shaw, Ben Ryan. Something else, I've written a book, Scars and Guitars, Volume 1, Conversations from the World of Heavy Metal and Beyond, and yes, the members of Cradle of Filth do feature amongst its pages. Click on the link in the banner if you'd like to try a sample. Go to a marketplace and download a sample, and if you do complete the purchase, do hit me up because I want to thank you personally. On that note, here's some more information about the book, but before I let you go, my name's Andrew Mackay-Smith and I'm the host of the Scars and Guitars podcast series. Thanks so much for tuning in.
This is Eric Rattan of Cannibal Corpse. You are listening to the Scars and Guitars podcast with Andrew Mackay-Smith.
I've been the host of the Scars and Guitars podcast since 2017. The first musician I interviewed for the show was David Vincent from Morbid Angel, and things have just snowballed from there. In all, I've posted almost 650 podcast episodes featuring conversations with many of the leading lights of rock, heavy metal, and beyond. It just got to a point where I thought, I need to write a book about all this, so that's exactly what I did. In Scars and Guitars Volume 1, you'll read a heap of deep reveals and commentary, such as Des Fafara talking about Coal Chamber, and why the band will never return.
You know, if you're a band just starting out, you need to hear me. Do not start a band with partners. Ever.
Yeah, wise words there. Sage advice, mate, for anybody.
Don't ever, because I can't go do Cold Chamber right now unless I get others involved.
Phil Anselmo talks about the episode in his career which gives him the greatest sense of accomplishment.
I think the staying power of the fans and the staying power of the songs, you know, whether it's Pantera, Down, or Superjoint, the fans remember the songs.
Alex Skolnick from Testament confirms that, yes, playing the guitar in Ozzy's band is anything but an ordinary gig. Will Silent Oz from Dimmu Borgir write a book? Pa from Sabaton gives advice to people who want to start a band.
Look at the team around you, look at the bandmates. If the guys want to be on the stage, then it's all cool. If the guys want to be backstage, then it's not going to be cool.
Current and former members of Cradle of Filth discuss the band's seminal 90s material. Read about the reaction to George Lynch and Mark from Suicide Silence's comments when they throw shade at then President Donald Trump.
We have this idiotic monster, you know, this egotistical, self-aggrandizing, complete piece of shit in there. I just can't understand how we've gotten to this place.
And yeah, we kicked a hornet's nest with Sepultura. Percussive overlord Gene Hoglan talks about recording with Chuck Schuldiner.
Chuck was always, he was very, very open-minded, and he was into having his musicians that were playing with him just reach out for the best stuff that they had.
Phil Campbell from Motorhead discusses what it takes to get sober. John Five answers his critics who dismiss his tenure with Marilyn Manson.
You know, my name is John Five, and Manson gave me that name, and I had some of the best years of my life in that band and learned a lot.
And we get the lowdown on Treyarch Zagtoth from those who would know, including his mother. All across Scars and Guitars Volume 1, there are moments of tension, relief, tragedy, exhilaration, and throughout it all, you'll obtain insight that I believe no one else has managed to obtain from many of your favourite artists. So treat yourself. Scars and Guitars Volume 1 is currently available as an ebook with a print edition on the horizon. Follow the links attached and download a sample. I'm sure you'll be compelled to read the whole book.